The question is, why aren't there more soil carbon projects? West Australian soils are quite challenging in a lot of ways, and so in the eastern states it's a bit low-hanging fruit. It's easy for them to go and do a lot of those in those richer soils. So if you look at the projects that have been registered over the last few years, they tend to be in that higher rainfall, dairy product, those higher productive lands. So when we were talking back in 2018 when this first method was coming out, there was one of those carbon service providers that was quite keen to come out, but because there were so many opportunities over there, they've sort of concentrated their effort in that sort of area. So that's why we're trying to push forward this project to try and get more projects happening in Western Australia, because of course it's the chicken and the egg thing. We don't have lots of projects, so therefore we don't have a lot of skills. The market remains relatively immature. So until we get more projects and get some more momentum and people feel confident in getting these projects up and running, then it stays relatively becalmed, I guess you could say. The other problem is that carbon has been quite cheap. When the emissions trading scheme finished in about 2014, the price of carbon then was around about $24. Once that disappeared and we went to the Emissions Reduction Fund, because they were pushing so hard to have low cost abatement, it stayed around $13, $14, $15. It makes it really difficult to overcome the cost, because you've got a big investment at the front, and then you've got some years before you'll get a return. And what has happened is that people are not prepared to carry that cost for such long periods of time, and therefore it makes it unviable. So consequently, we haven't had those projects being set up because they're expensive. Even if you do a biodiverse plantings project, it's big upfront costs of ecological surveys and buying all the seed and the seedling and putting them all in and those types of things. So that's where the land restoration program comes into, is that we want to provide some of those upfront costs in exchange for those ACCUs, for which we will pay more than the standard price, because we want to encourage those projects. And so therefore we'll pay a bit of a premium for them because of the co-benefits that go with them. Yes, Hayden.
Kerry, the question around viability is very much related to the question around Western Australian soils.
Yes.
So just the question around viability is very much centred around the nature of Western Australian soils and what we know about the soils and what we don't know about them. And so in this process, you've put forward Look-See as being the tool that we're expected to use to determine what the possible sequestration rate might be. But when you try to build a project based on those very conservative sequestration rates with massive holes in the data, it kind of makes it a little bit difficult to have those pieces of string meet. So can you expand a bit on that for me, please?
So Look-See is a tool that was built by the CSIRO, and the data that goes into it is reasonably thin on the ground, I guess you could say. We've got some good data in DPIRD, for instance. There's some soil carbon data across Australia, etc. But because soil varies so much, and because West Australian soils are really quite different to some of the other soils, it does make it quite difficult to be able to get models that do an accurate assessment of the soil carbon. So as a consequence of that, although we're using the Look-See because it makes it relatively easy for us all to access it, because there are other tools that could be used, we don't have an accurate full cam, for instance, like they do for vegetation and so on. So it does make it quite difficult for us to be able to estimate what the true capacity of West Australian soils are. We think we know what's been done in the past. There has been changes to the approaches to changing soil carbon in West Australian soils. That's why we want to get these projects going, so we can find out truly what it is using the Emissions Reduction Fund process, which is sampling, etc. It'll give us some genuine data. We'll actually be able to say, we know now that if you do these things on this type of soil in this area, you'll get this much sequestration. So even the Clean Energy Regulator will say, we don't really take a lot of stock in what people's forward estimates are, because they too are in this exploratory phase. they don't really know exactly how much carbon can be sequestered in the soil projects that exist in Australia, let alone Western Australia. So it's a challenging one. And we all know that the weather will affect your soil carbon, etc., etc. So what we've got to do is find long-term solutions to that. Things that actually will sequester carbon for the long term, like those native grasses and things like that. They seem to be able to handle, obviously, our conditions here. Maybe we should be concentrating a lot more of those sorts of things so we can get a longer term benefit.